Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those on the West Coast. My name is Tom Small. I'm a financial advisor at Raymond James, and here. It's a pleasure to be here with Joe Fahrenkoff from PKF O'Connor Davies, an employee benefit plan auditor. And today's presentation is called the Audit of the Future. So what we're going to talk through today is employee benefit plan audits. So for many of you are probably painstakingly aware, larger employers, larger 401k plans, depending upon the number of employees or the number of participants in their plan, are regulatorily required to be audited on a regular basis. So that's kind of what we'll get into today. We'll also talk about some Department of Labor tips, some IRS tips, and then we'll take some Q&A at the end. And Joe, if you want to just give a quick introduction, and then we'll hop right in.
Great, thanks, Tom. So good morning, everybody. Yeah, so my name is Joseph Fahrenkoff. I'm a partner at PKF O'Connor Davies. At PKF O'Connor Davies, we do about 600 employee benefit plan audits a year, so it's a large part of our practice. We felt that we needed a dedicated service group to that area, and I work 100% of my time. All I do is employee benefit plans. Again, we have about 20 dedicated individuals and some other in the firm that help out in that area. I've been with the firm for 14 years now and still going strong. So I started my career. I plan on ending it here. But yeah, we can jump right into the presentation.
Awesome. And one more bit of housekeeping. We will, subsequent to this call, we're going to send out an email with the deck itself and then also some information about CE. For anyone who's going to apply for CE for this presentation, that will be sent out after the call today.
Great. So we'll jump into the first topic here. So cybersecurity. I'm sure that this is not the first time that you've all been talking about this or heard about this. Hopefully it's not the first time. And just a quick tidbit why I thought this was important to re-highlight here, and you'll see the 2021 date in the first bullet point. I somewhat recently had a client receive a questionnaire from the Department of Labor regarding cybersecurity. So I thought it was important to revisit this. A lot of what is it provided in the guidance that they put out in 2021 was on that request list. So, good practice. I thought we'd go back through that today, talk a little bit about it. As I alluded to here, in 2021, the Department of Labor, they released some guidance for plan sponsors, plan fiduciaries, record keepers, plan participants. And really what it is just best practices over maintaining cybersecurity, right? And the first piece is, tips on hiring a service provider. And we'll go through these three in detail in the next couple slides. But cybersecurity best practices, online security tips. And really what these were meant to do was to supplement, some of the guidance that was already put out by the EBSA, which is the Employee Benefit Plan Security Administration. And that previous guidance, talked about provisions on ensuring that electronic record keeping systems have reasonable controls, adequate record retention, electronic disclosure systems, including measured, calculated, and protected personal identifiable information, right? That's the goal. They want to make, when you look at these plans, right, these are kind of like the gold standard for somebody that wants to get PII. There's just so much that is in these plans, in addition to just the assets that these plans hold. So cybersecurity is key in protecting all of that. So if we jump right into the next slide, we'll go through here some tips on hiring a service provider with strong cybersecurity practices. Whether you're currently with a provider that you've been with for a long time, or you're considering changing a provider, I think in the proposal process, this should be a key part of that proposal process, or the RFP process, I should say, in terms of, what is that provider's, cybersecurity practices, how do they protect your data? As you know, with an RFP, right, it shouldn't always just be, who's the cheapest, right? There's a lot of other kind of objective things that go into it besides the price. So you have to feel comfortable with it all. And just talking as a service provider, right? I work at a public accounting firm. I've been seeing an uptick in the number of new clients that we propose on that are asking about our cybersecurity practices. What do we do as a firm to protect their data in these audits? So it is something that I think is important for you all to be including in that process when you're going out to RFP. Or if you're happy with your provider and you're not even thinking about RFP, still just asking these questions and documenting it, as you'll see later on the questionnaire that was sent out. This is something that the DOL is curious in. So they want to know what you've done, how you've documented it. So the first item on here is just asking about their information security standards. What are their practices and policies, audit results. So you want to look for a provider that's using recognized standards, that's going through an outside audit by a third party to validate those cybersecurity practices that they have in place. So it's great that they tell you they're in place, but are they working, and what have they done to validate it? So asking that, looking at those results, documenting that you've gone through that process is definitely key. So we just talked about validating those practices. What security standards have they met? Look for contract provisions that allow you to view those audit results. So they might tell you in that RFP process that they do it, show you the results, but can you continue to look at that each year? Are they going to make that available to you? So you want to make sure that that's there and available for you each year. Look at their track record, right? And I think the easiest thing to do in any process is just Google them. What have they gotten into in the past? Have they had any cybersecurity incidents? Is there any pending litigation? Past breaches, if they did have them, you want to know, what happened, what went wrong, how did they respond to it? So what is their obligation to inform you when there's a security breach? So all those things are important to ask about. And then on the next one here, we have insurance policies, right? So if something does go wrong, who's going to cover it? Do they have insurance that's going to cover it? Or is it something that's going to fall back on you? So, asking that question, documenting what the responses are is important in the process. When you're contracting with the service provider, you're going to have to sign a probably pretty lengthy contract. And you want to make sure in that contract that has certain things, right? So you want to make sure that they have ongoing compliance with cybersecurity and information system standards. You want to be aware of contracts that are going to limit, the service provider's responsibility for IT breaches. So again, reading through those contracts, understanding what's in them, what your responsibilities are, what their responsibilities are, is really important. And so in the last piece here, there's just some thoughts on things that you want to try to ensure are included in those contracts. So information on security reporting, the use of sharing of information and confidentiality. Right, you don't want them using your data for other purposes of their business. So, what are they doing with all that data that they have that you've given them? Notification of those security breaches if it ever does occur. What is their responsibility for notifying you? So you want that in the contract. Compliance with record retention and destruction. So you don't want these things living, or this information potentially living out there forever. How at what point do they destruct it? How long do they hold on to it for? Privacy and information security laws and insurance, as we talked about above. So making sure that it's in the contract that they're going to maintain compliance with those laws, with those insurance requirements. And feel free to send in questions along the way. If there's any questions, we can stop at any point. Just talk about that in more detail if needed. Just gonna grab that quick. So jumping into the next slide. Here we have cybersecurity program best practices. So this is really, in my opinion, this is meant for the plan sponsors, right? So this is stuff that you're going to want to do with regards to cybersecurity of your plan, of your data that you have. So number one, and probably the most important in my opinion here, is a formal, well-documented cybersecurity program, right? So you might have a cybersecurity program that's written for your entity, for the company itself, but do you have one specifically for the plan? Right? When you think about the plan, right, it's its own separate, legal entity. It has a lot of data in it. There's a lot of money involved in it. So, it's definitely wise to have a separate written plan on, what that cybersecurity program looks like for your plan. Prudent annual risk assessments. Surprisingly, this is an area that I see a lot of my clients don't do that great of a job at. But, for every plan, you should have a separate committee that meets reviewing this plan, or the plan, I should say. And at that committee meeting, once a year, I think at a minimum, you should be doing some level of a risk assessment. So not saying that something is going to go wrong, but if it did go wrong, what would it be? and how would you respond to it? So that's the whole purpose of a risk assessment, right? You're going through the what ifs. So if this happened, how would we handle it? So it's important to do, once a year, just kind of think outside the box. What could go wrong? Reliability of third-party audit and security controls. So a lot of times, I'll admit I'm not an IT guru. I don't specifically specialize in cybersecurity, although I feel like, my role as an auditor is definitely heading in that direction. I have to know, enough to talk intelligently about it. But again, we have a whole separate group here at BKF O'Connor Davies that's all they do is, cybersecurity, assessments. And so, again, you may not have that specialty internally, or that specialty internally, but it might be something that you want to outsource to somebody to help with and do an assessment. I'm not saying it has to be done every year, but at some point you should have that done, and it should be done, at a reasonable interval. Probably annually would be best, but feasibly that's probably not practical for many companies. So clearly defined and assigned information security roles and responsibilities. So this is, a big one that we've been looking at, like logical access, right? So who has access to what systems? Do they have the right level of responsibility or access level given to them for those systems? How often do you review that? If somebody leaves the organization, how quickly do you terminate their access to those IT securities or those IT systems? It's something, again, that should be in your formal, well-documented cybersecurity program. How are we going to handle that? How often are we going to review those roles? Strong access control procedures. So again, who has the ability to give people access? Who has those administrative access rights? Assets or data stored in the cloud management by third-party providers are subject to appropriate security reviews and independent security assessments. So, are you assessing those service providers? What are you doing? Are you getting their SOC reports, their IT SOC reports, and reviewing them? Are you having a conversation with them once a year to understand what they're doing with your information? So, that should be part of the assessment that's done. Cybersecurity awareness training. I think to be quite honest, I know we do a lot of it, at our firm. We have those phishing emails that come out that, I'm 9 out of 10 on. I try to do a pretty good job, but every once in a while they get me. They've gotten pretty good. But I think a lot of insurance policies actually require that you do this, or if not required, it actually it may help you reduce your insurance costs if you are doing cybersecurity awareness training. And I think it's just important as a company to be doing that, to educate your employees, to protect, not only the company, but, in this case, the plan. Security system development lifecycle programs. So just, how often do you have to change things up there? A business program which efficiently addresses business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident responses. So this is actually an interesting one. I have a good example here. So I'm actually up at our Boston office today. I'm located in New York out of our Westchester, Harrison office. But I got to the hotel up here, and as you're all probably aware, that the CrowdStrike software update put a lot of computers down. So as a business, could you continue your daily business without the computers, right? And so I checked into the hotel. And they pulled out this book that almost looked like, the old baseball card book. And they pulled out the card and they said, "This is a MasterCard for your room. Please don't lose this, because we can't create another one right now because our systems are still down from that security update, issue." So, they had a plan in place, right? They can't use their computers currently to make new cards, but they had a book that had all the cards for every room in the hotel available that they could still give to their guests when they checked in. So, do you have those business continuity plans in place? Could you continue if the computers were down, or if there was a cybersecurity breach? Disaster recovery, right? If you lost all your information, is it backed up? Can you get all the HR data that's stored out there now, right? Very rarely do clients keep paper documents anymore. Everything's scanned in, or it's in an HRIS. So could you recover that if it was lost? And so not just knowing that you're backing it up, but are you practicing? Are you going through that exercise to see, does it actually work? And then lastly, an incident response. So if you had an incident, what would you do about it? Who would you report it to? So what does that process look like? And do you practice it? I think it's important to do those kind of mock drills so that everybody's aware of it. Encryption and sensitive data stored in transit. So just again, example as a firm, right? I can't send an email if it has social security number in it. It'll actually give me an error message and it'll tell me can't send. I have to redact that information, whether it's an attachment or in the email. And then even incoming emails will get rejected by our server if it picks up that there's any PII in it. So, we don't want emails in our incoming emails with sensitive data that now we're responsible for. So it just rejects it before it even comes in. So, do you have those types of things in place? Feel free to stop me. I see that somebody's hand is raised and has a question, but happy to either go over that now or at the end of the slide here.
Yeah, we'll if you have questions now, you can put them into Q&A. We're manning that, and then at the end, for anyone who wants to raise their hand, we can open it up for Q&A at the end.
Great. So strong technical controls, implemented best security practices, responsiveness to cybersecurity incidents and breaches. As I mentioned, what is your response? Who are you gonna report it to? What are you gonna do? Do you practice that? So people come and go from an organization. People are probably gonna play different roles in that whole response, and you want to practice that. Certainly probably once a year. Certainly when new people come in, make sure they're aware of what the practices are. So again, some good cybersecurity practices that you should have in place or at least be thinking about. So if we jump to the next slide. Here's just some online security tips, probably things that you've seen before, but always good to go over again. So, register, set up, routinely monitor your online accounts. I'm probably one of the culprits out there too. I probably don't log into, either my where my paycheck comes in or where my bank account or even old emails accounts, things like that often, and just monitoring them. So one of the questions I always ask my clients on an audit is, when we're going through some interviews, I'll ask them how quick would it take you to notice that there was, depending on the size of the plan, $1 million missing from plan assets, $10 million missing from plan assets. Would you notice 2 days after, a week after, a month after? So how often are you actually logging in and looking at the plan assets, the transactions that are flowing through the plan? So it's really important to set up some type of routine to monitor your plan, the assets, the transactions that are running through it, and just do it frequently. Use some strong, unique passwords. I don't think this is anything new to anybody here. I think we're up to 16 characters now or something like that. So it's getting longer and longer every time. Multi-factor authentication. I'm sure a lot of you do that as well. You got to enter the password, and then next thing you know, you get a text message, and you got to enter that back on your computer, or even the facial recognition. We have an app now where when we log into our systems, I then have to put in not only a code from my computer, but then it also verifies it from my phone so that I can log into our system. So, that extra layer, that extra 10 seconds of inconvenience or 20 seconds of inconvenience of getting that text, I mean, it's a huge piece of protection. So, when you're implementing those things, you really have to weigh like what is, I know people are going to be annoyed that they have to go through this extra step, but how much value are you adding from that? And it's a huge value add having that multi-factor authentication. So if you don't have that in place, it's something you should strongly consider. Personal contact information current. I mean, that's a big one, right? So if there was a security breach and now they're trying to send you a letter in the mail, but you have an old address up there, you're not going to get that. You're not going to be aware of it. So it's important to keep that contact information current on your accounts. This way you can be contacted easily. Close or delete unused accounts. So if you're not using an old email account, you're not using, I don't know, whatever it is. Email account's probably the best example here. But if you're not using that, you should shut it down, delete it, right? Somebody gets in there, they can then, pretend to be you, start sending emails, getting information that might be in there for whatever reason, but close those out. Free Wi-Fi. I actually never connect to Wi-Fi outside my house or office. I carry around, I'm lucky enough to have one of those little hotspots that I've been given, from the firm. I think it's just a huge liability to be connecting to any unsecured Wi-Fi. It's just it's a big no-no. Beware of phishing attacks. So I talked about that earlier. I'm pretty good, but I've gotten caught once or twice and had to go back through the training, the 10-minute training, whatever they make you do after you accidentally click on it. So it's just good practice to understand what those look like. Antivirus software, keeping software up to date. Didn't work out too well with CrowdStrike recently, but but it is something that you want to do. You want to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date antivirus software, that everything's current. So if you haven't updated your iPhone ISO software anytime recently, you should do that. It's just going to protect everything. I know how to report identity theft, cybersecurity incidents. So having those numbers available for the individuals that you should be reporting that stuff to is important. So here is kind of the trigger of why I want to re-go through all that cybersecurity information or guidance that was put out there by the DOL in 2001. So this was something that was recently received by one of my clients. This was sent out by the DOL. It was a formal letter from the Department of Labor with all these bullet points listed out there. It is a little bit of a repeat of what we talked about. So, we'll go through it kind of high level, but you'll see in here just from what they were asking this client of, what they're looking for. And it really mirrors that guidance that they sent out. So they sent that out in 2001, all that guidance. They gave everybody some time to implement that stuff. And now, to me, it feels like they're kind of going out and assessing, right, what level of implementation has there been from that guidance. We sent responses back. We helped the client with this process. They sent responses back to the DOL. There was no enforcement taken by them, but that's not to say that in the future that they may not start taking enforcement on these things. I currently sit on the AICPA's expert panel for employee benefit plans, and Michael Auerbach is on that committee. And it's something that I plan on bringing up to him at our next meeting to try to get a sense of where is the DOL going with this. So unfortunately, I don't have that information for you at the moment, but it is something that I'm interested to see. Where are they going with this? So in the first bullet point here, you see there's a ton of sub bullet points. So they want all those policies, procedures, guidelines, relating to cybersecurity that we kind of talked about earlier. So, what is your data governance, disposal process, implementation of access controls, multi-factor authentication. So they want to know about that. As we talked about it earlier, the business continuity, disaster recovery, incident responses, those risk assessments, right? We talked about data privacy, management of vendors and third-party service providers. So, what are you doing to review them? What are their notification protocols in a cybersecurity event? Cybersecurity awareness training we talked about. So these are it's really a repeat of what we were talking about earlier. It's all in here. Encryption to protect all sensitive information transmitted, stored, or in transit. Again, that well-written policy is gonna be key, right? So if you have this all written and it's down on paper and you can just hand that over when they come in and ask for this stuff, it's gonna go a long way of just showing good governance and that you're actually following your fiduciary responsibilities and protecting this data for your plan and your plan participants. So this is just one bullet point on that request list. If we jump to the next slide, we'll keep going here. So the next slide, they're talking about they want all documents and communications related to any past cybersecurity incidents, including any incidents involving fraud through identity theft. They want to know about the insurance policies, what type of coverage do you have in these instances. And again, this is some stuff that goes back to you might not be able to answer all this just on your own. You're going to have to talk to your service provider to get some of these answers. And they actually had that caveat at the end of this letter where they said, you may not be able to answer this all. Please consult with your service providers to get the proper responses to some of these. So I think if you take that first one that we had, that first piece of guidance, and you get those answers and you document that, it's going to go a long way. So again, risk assessment reports, security controls, audit reports, audit files, penetration testing, third-party cybersecurity analysis. So all documents, communications describing security reviews and independent security assessments. So they want to know, are you looking at your cybersecurity? Have you done any assessments done by a third party? What were the results of those? So definitely important things to do if you're not doing. All documents describing any security system development life. We talked about that earlier. All documents describing security technical controls, including firewalls, anti-software, backup, all documents, communications for service providers relating to their cybersecurity capabilities and procedures, communications from service providers regarding policies, procedures, collecting, storing, archiving, deleting, all those things. Documents and communications describing the permitted use by data by the sponsors. So again, they want to know, they have your data. What are they doing with it? Do you know what they're doing with it? Are they doing anything besides using it for the purposes of record keeping your plan? So let's go to the next slide.
And Joe, just one one point. I think you think about the sheer number of vendors that are touching plans, depending upon the size or the structure of your plan, you're going to have a record keeper. So the place that actually physically holds the money. You may have a third-party administrator doing some of the administrative functions. You may have an advisor, and if you're getting audited, you have an auditor. I guess attorneys have some access to PII in certain cases. So it's incumbent upon a plan sponsor and the committee run at the plan sponsor, not only to think about their internal controls, but also to be able to monitor and document that they've done due diligence on all those service providers, and then understanding how much access to data they have, and then their internal procedures, coverage, insurance, all those different things. So it's a lot. I think it's probably a lot of work on the upfront, but then it can become more routine, ongoing, where you've done this due diligence and you're refreshing it. But there's a lot of folks touching your plan, so to speak, that are involved in some nature with PII at different levels.
Yeah, and I think you put it perfectly, Tom. It shouldn't just be a one and done type thing. It's a continual assessment that should be being done, frequently, if not annually. So it is something that you should be updating, right? So you do it once, you update it, you continue to monitor it. As I mentioned earlier, for a couple of my clients, I have to do an annual IT assessment, and a lot of it is covered by a lot of it covers cybersecurity. So I'm lucky enough that I have somebody that can pass that off to internally that handles all those. But it can be overwhelming. I mean, some of those assessments that we go through are 300 plus questions. It's a lot. So there's a lot that you should be asking, a lot that you should be documenting. And again, if the Department of Labor does come in, ask you these questions, having those responses available, to just kind of hand over is going to go a long way in the eyes of whoever it is that's running that review of the plan. So again, it's just going to show good governance if you're ahead of this, and it is where I think these plans are heading. I just think it is important to have all of this, and so we've been talking about it for a long time, and it's time to really start implementing some of this stuff and documenting it. So in talking about all that cybersecurity, I thought an important piece to cover also is SOC 1 reports, and I try to educate my clients, because to be quite honest, a lot of times when I bring up SOC reports for the first time, with new clients, they kind of look at me like a deer in the headlight. What is that? They've never heard of it before, or just never even received it or looked at it. But you can see a lot within these SOC 1 reports regarding IT security at the service providers. There's specific SOC 1 reports that they can provide you that just cover their IT security. So for us on the audits, it's a large piece of, I shouldn't say large, but it's a very important piece of the audit process, is understanding, again, I'll back up for a second. So a SOC 1 report is the assessment of the controls that are in place at the service organization. For example, your record keeper, your payroll provider, right? You're outsourcing those services to them. And what this SOC 1 report does is it's going to give you, the user entity, some comfort that that service organization has controls in place over the data that you're giving them for them, to then produce those reports for you. So it's an important piece for us on the audit to see, hey, is this service provider that they're using, reliable? Do they have any control deficiencies where we might want to focus more time in the audit? Because I know the controls that they had over benefit payments were, there were findings, so that, we might want to do a little bit extra work there. But it is something that as part of your ongoing review of service providers from a fiduciary responsibility, that you should be reviewing every year, and just seeing, are there any issues here that we need to be aware of or think about, or, talk to them, more about. And we have seen service providers SOC 1 reports with exceptions, and modified opinions. So this report is produced by an independent auditor, and they issue an opinion over those controls, the operating effectiveness of those controls. So there's really two types. So there's SOC 1 and type 1 and type 2. The type 1 is just going to cover a specific point in time. It's just going to talk to, what are the controls that they have in place, versus the SOC 2 report actually covers a period of time, and it's going to give you some assurance over not only the design of the controls, but also the operating effectiveness and the results of those tests. So the one that you want is the type 2 report. So if we jump into the next slide here, this is just a bit of a layout of what those SOC 1 reports look like. So first, you have the independent service auditors report, the opinion. So, when you get the report, one of the first things you should do is just, did they get a clean opinion? Are there any qualifications in there that are being called out that we want to look into? It's going to be the quick, easiest, down and dirty way to see, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? You have management's written assertions. So management of that service organization, they have some assertions in there. There's a write-up from them. Service organization's description of systems. So it's going to talk about all the different systems that they use. The complementary user entity controls we'll talk about a little bit later on, but that's a really important piece as well. So I won't dive right into that, but that's definitely, if I was going to highlight, the areas on here, it's going to be the auditor's report, the complementary user entity controls, and the next bullet point here, the control objectives. So the control objectives are those tests that the service auditor is performing over the controls at the service organization, where you're going to see if there's exceptions in those tests that they're doing over those controls. You have other information from the service organization, subservice organizations, related carve-outs. Just a tidbit on that last one. You're outsourcing payroll to your service provider, your payroll provider. They might be outsourcing a certain service to now what's referred to as a subservice organization. So, it keeps going down the line. So if they're outsourcing a major piece of what they do for you to somebody else, that subservice provider, you may want to consider getting that subservice provider SOC 1 report and seeing what their controls look like, if you think it has a large impact on the service they're providing you. So on the next slide here, so the SOC 1 report, when you get it, you probably want to get it for when we're talking about a plan for the trustee or custodian, the record keeper, any payroll provider, HRIS, and you might be saying, why do we need it for the payroll provider on the employee benefit plan audit? When you think about it, a lot of the transactions that go into a plan run through your payroll are based off of compensation. So it's important to ensure that those reports that your payroll provider is providing you, have the proper controls over them. You want to make sure that what report are you getting? Are you getting a type 1 or are you getting a type 2? Again, the type 2 is the one that you want. Adequate coverage. So these reports are not always on a calendar year, or maybe your plan isn't on a calendar year. So in a lot of cases, you can get what's referred to as a gap letter or a bridge letter. So let's just say the report is from 10/1 to 9/30, right? You're going to have 3 months where this report doesn't cover the calendar year. What they do is they'll send you over a bridge letter or a gap letter, it's commonly referred to, that says, hey, the controls that we had in place in that prior report that was issued, nothing's changed. And it gives you some level of assurance that there's been no major changes since that report was performed, or those control tests were performed. You want to look at the opinion that's in that SOC 1 report, look for any qualifications. And you also want to consider, who's the auditor that's performing this on this SOC 1 report, right? So is it a nationally recognized firm? Did they get a clean peer review letter? So things that you can consider about the service auditor that actually did the work on the SOC 1 report. As I alluded to earlier, complementary user entity controls. I'm going to say CUECs for now on because it's a mouthful. So the CUECs, these are the controls that the service organization expects you, the user entity, to have in place, right? And so the thought behind this is, yeah, we're your service provider, but unless you have some controls in place over the information that you're giving us and the service that we're providing you, you can't rely on our controls. So it's kind of like the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. So there'll be things in there like, who's reviewing the information to ensure it's complete and accurate before it's sent over. Who's ensuring that only the proper people have access to the system. So that's an important piece to read through and just ensure that you have controls in place over, those areas that they expect you to be covering. So jumping out of the SOC 1 report, the next piece I want to cover here is just some changes at the Department of Labor that I felt were important to highlight. So, I also I'm currently the chair of the New York State Society's CPA Employee Benefit Plan Committee, and we just did our annual conference back in June, and Department of Labor gave a presentation. And I borrowed some information from that on the updates because I thought it was important to pass along to everybody today on the call. So one of the big things that they're looking at is PII that's coming in on the 5500 filings. They're seeing it more and more where there's social securities included in social security numbers included in the filings, account numbers, people attaching the 8955 SSA. If you don't know what that is, that's the information that goes to the Social Security Administration on people that left the plan that have account balances, but it includes that form includes social security numbers on it. People were attaching that to the 5500. So they're taking enforcement and rejecting 5500s if it has this information in it. And you can see here, in the 2023 form 5500 instructions, they're putting an emphasis on, do not include this information in the filings. They'll reject it, and they're asking people to report it if they do see it out there, because as you know, these 5500s are public information. Anybody can go to Department of Labor's website eFast and just look up any company and pull this information. So you don't want social security numbers in those filings because it's public information. So please review your 5500s. Make sure you don't have any social security numbers, account numbers, things like that in there that shouldn't be in there. So one of the things they wanted to emphasize was the difference between a delinquent filer versus a deficient filer. So a deficient filer is somebody that's kind of, just to put it simply, has made a mistake on the filing, right? So so you made the Form 5500 filing, it was done timely for 12/31 year ends, that's 7 months after year end, or you have the, for any plan, it's 7 months after year end, or you have the ability to file an extension, which is an additional 2.5 months for calendar years, that's July 31st, and the extension is October 15th. So you filed on time. The problem with your filing is that there's something that's incomplete or inaccurate in it. So for example, it's missing the independent qualified plan auditor's report, or it's just improperly completed. You check the wrong boxes. It could be as simple as that. They will reject it, and they'll expect you to correct that within a specific period of time. Generally, it's 45 days. You want to respond to it, let them know that you corrected it. If you don't respond to them, that's the worst thing you could do, because the next letter that you're going to get is going to have a pretty significant penalty in it. So what you want to do is amend that filing as soon as possible and send that response to them, which will be outlined in that letter. Otherwise, you'll be subject to total rejection or further enforcement action. Versus a delinquent filer, so now the 5500 just has not been filed timely. So non-filer or late filer. So what they want you to be doing is using that delinquent filer voluntary correction program to correct that delinquent filing. And I believe you can only use that if you haven't been notified by them yet. So, if you know you are late and you haven't filed that 5500 yet, get it filed and go through this program, the DFVC program, as soon as possible. Don't let it linger. Get up to date. Because again, the penalties, which we'll go over, can get pretty significant, which they've recently updated here. So penalties. So the regulations allow them to enforce penalties of up to $2,586 per day, which for deficient filers. So historically, that was limited to $150 a day. They've increased that now to $390 a day. So that can add up quickly. So historically, there's been a limitation or a $50,000 cap on the total penalty. That cap has been totally removed. I have seen plans receive six-figure penalty letters. It's never fun. I mean, just talking to Michael Arabak at the DOL, he takes no joy in sending those letters. They don't get to keep the money, as he says. So again, if you get a letter, respond to them, do everything in your power to make the correction. I think keeping that open line of communication with them is the most important thing that you can do, because they are pretty reasonable in terms of, if they do send you a penalty, and kind of working with you. They're not looking to put people out of business, right? This is a plan that you're providing for the benefit of your employees. So they will work with you, but if you're not responsive, if you're not being helpful, if you're not, trying this, they probably will be less helpful. And then lastly, repeat offenders. They are really going after repeat offenders. So worst thing you could do is fall into one of those categories in 1 year and do the same thing again the next year. The penalties is × 2 here. So it's $780 a day. And again, as you can imagine, that adds up really quickly. So that's some update here on the penalties.
Yeah, and Joe, this is why, or for anyone on the call that is going through their audit on a yearly basis, this is why if you're a procrastinator or your record keeper wasn't able to furnish you data until later in the process, this is why your auditor is hounding you in early to mid-October. I'm sure they've been hounding you for a long time. Auditors take no pleasure in going up to the deadline, but that October 15th for those plan sponsors and plans that are extending, that's what you're trying to avoid, these penalties. You don't want to have to go through the delinquent or the deficient or the delinquent in this case. You really want to get it in. And we understand that a lot of times it's record keepers are late in producing reports, or they can be slow. That's why it's great to have an auditor on your side that is pressuring or applying pressure with your advisor, with other of your service providers to get the data that you need, the audit package from your record keeper custodian, so that this can be done well in advance and there's not hiccups late or things that weren't completed, like a correction wasn't completed or some sort of non-discrimination testing wasn't done. That's why to get it done as early as possible is better, or to allow yourself to be done as early as possible, because the auditor has to look at the draft 5500 that can be produced by, or the 5500 data that's coming from the record keeper and the back and forth there. All that can add time here. So the earlier, the better, as with everything.
Yeah, it's stressful for us as the auditors, and I'm sure it's stressful for you as the client. Nobody wants to bump up against those deadlines. So the most important thing you can do is just be communicative and follow up on, open items, and talk to your record keepers and make sure they kind of have the information timely and what they need to do that.
Yeah. So along those lines, we're going to just jump into a couple different things. So we've seen in our client base, the IRS been a little bit more active. So you can get audit requests from the IRS, from the Department of Labor as well. We've seen an uptick in the IRS lately. Here's kind of like the top 10 issues that we're seeing out there related to these audit requests or letters that clients have received from the IRS. Some of them are just completely random. They do a number of random audits per year. Some of them there may be a trigger, but anything related to a plan terminating. If you have a pension plan terminating, they're going to go through this automatically. M&A, that's obviously a big trigger. But then they're also looking at non-discrimination testing, compensation, the definition of compensation somewhat related to that. And then on the other side, handling of distributions and loans, excess salary deferrals and employer contributions. So that's related to non-discrimination testing. You want to make sure that your non-discrimination testing is done early. So if you have to process refunds, if you failed testing, you want to do that in a timely fashion to avoid excise taxes. And then at the end there, lack of internal controls and use of incorrect data on Form 5500. Joe talked about that in terms of deficient filings. You want to make sure all these things, you want to make sure you're documenting a process around them, trying to get them done earlier in the year. And from our perspective as an advisor, having a very strong auditor helps with all of these things, because some of the tests that they do are related to these. They're making sure they're going through their checklist, making sure that all the things that that you need to do, that you're required to do, are being done, or they have it's not all encompassing, but it's a very valuable thing, set of eyes on your plan from the IRS. And then jumping back to the DOL, same thing here. If you get you can get an audit request from the Department of Labor. They're coming at it from a slightly different angle. Their biggest thing, what we're seeing a lot of, and Joe and other auditors across the country are spending a lot of time on this, is the late deposit of deferrals. So some of the testing that auditors will do, and what the DOL is looking at, is if you process payroll on Fridays and you have electronic payroll systems, and you typically deposit the pay or remit 401k contributions 2 business days after that, or a business day after that, or on payroll day. If all of a sudden over the course of the year you had some turnover in payroll and finance, and all of a sudden it's taking you 7, 8, 9 business days, where it usually takes you 1, 2, or 3, those kinds of things are what the Department of Labor is looking at. It's one thing if there's turnover and it's very temporary, but if it's habitual, or in a very cynical case where the company's holding the money because they want to, they don't want to part with the money so quickly, that's kind of what the Department of Labor is looking at. Excessive service provider fees, fiduciaries that didn't know and fulfill their duties, imprudent investments, bankruptcies, abandoned plans, hard to value assets. So the Department of Labor, they're taking a little bit different than the IRS. Some of this is more process related, a little bit more qualitative, but that late deposit of deferrals is one of the biggest ones we're seeing out there. And that's definitely quantifiable. At the bottom there, the number one trigger for an audit is participant complaints. There's sometimes it can just be a disgruntled employee. Maybe there was a bad breakup, they were terminated for cause or something like that. If you Google, how can I get back at my company, or how could I, make my company's life difficult, you may see, if you were to Google that, you may see, file a complaint with the Department of Labor on not even related to the 401k, but you could, a lot of different things you could file complaints on. Complaints are just complaints. They don't necessarily have merit, but a lot of what Joe was talking about, all these things, you want to document the process, because people can say anything. People can say anything in a complaint. If you're confident about the processes that you're following and you've documented them, you can parry those sorts of things when the DOL or the IRS comes in. It's really important to have a process, but even more important to document that process, because even if you have a very good process, someone comes in and makes a claim, if you don't have it documented that you were doing all these things, it's going to be much harder to defend and parry away those claims than if you have a great process, but you're also documenting it. So really important. And when we get into here, the 10 steps fiduciaries can take to help manage their responsibilities and risks. I won't go through every one, but understanding roles and responsibilities, going through some fiduciary training, documenting that, establishing a formal fiduciary governance process. So again, documenting who's on the committee, what the roles of everyone on the committee are, documenting the roles of your independent consultants, hopefully having a co-fiduciary on the investment side. Again, documenting an investment policy statement, regular meeting minutes. You don't necessarily want your meeting minutes, they don't have to be, 15 pages long. You don't need to, keep a transcript of the meeting, but you want to keep a log of what topics were discussed. Was there a decision made? Just document that there was we reviewed this ABC fund. There was a vigorous debate and the committee voted to retain that fund or change that fund, those sorts of things. It doesn't need to be, 10 paragraphs about a decision, but you want to document that you had these decisions so that you have something you could point back to and say, hey, we did follow a process. You don't always have to be right, but you have to, you have to be prudent. You have to follow the plan document. You have to make sure that there's a duty of care, that you're, trying to do the right thing as much as possible. The Department of Labor, IRS don't define what the right decision is, but they require you to follow a prudent process. So, following best practices, documenting all these things, really, really important. At the bottom there, ensure adequate insurance coverage. Joe talked about this before, but it's whereas 10 years ago, cybersecurity was not even a thought in anyone's mind. When you're looking at fiduciary liability insurance, which is different than your fidelity bond coverage, fidelity bond or fiduciary bond that some folks call it, just covers theft and embezzlement from the plan. That's one of the items on your 5,500. You want to have at least 10% or up to a max of 500,000. But fiduciary liability insurance covers potentially officers, directors, and committee members that are covering the plan. We've seen a trend of also including some provisions around cybersecurity, so that if there was a breach or something went sideways related to cybersecurity, that you could potentially be covered. There's a lot of nuances to that. All these policies are written differently. There may not be as much coverage as you think, and really strong coverage may be very expensive. The point being, just dig in, really get an understanding of how you're covered, what's included, who's covered, and all that, and then keep informed of industry, regulatory, and legislative trends. So just kind of wrapping up here, maintain robust documentation. What should your ERISA retirement plan file, or whatever retirement, even if it's a non-ERISA retirement plan, having a fiduciary file, what should be in that? So number one, the plan document. Plan document is probably the single most important document or piece of the governing document for the entire plan, all the provisions, how the plan should run. And then there's also some other documents that are really important. The IPS, the investment policy statement. So that's roles, responsibilities, goals, objectives, how you're going to monitor funds, how you're going to keep track of them. Talking about the IPS can also speak to the responsibilities of your vendors as well. Fee disclosures, plan statements, service provider contracts and documents. I think Joe referenced this again before. I think contracts weren't nearly as scrutinized as they are now, given just the hypersensitivity to liability and cybersecurity. But taking a look at those periodically is a very good task to complete on a regular basis. Fidelity bond, fiduciary insurance, just talked about that. Meeting minutes, correspondence, reports and filings, quarterly performance reports, required notices that are going out to employees. There's a number of notices that are required on an annual basis or on a regular basis to your employees. You want to keep those a record of what that notice actually contained and when it was sent out, so that you can quickly document and easily point to, hey, we sent out our safe harbor notice, or we sent out our 404C notice, all these different things that are required on a regular basis. So again, I've kind of referenced this before. Process is in some ways even more important than outcomes, as long as it's documented. It kind of sometimes makes me think back to when we were all in school. and we're going through a math problem. And if you didn't show your work, the teacher may scold you and put, just because you got to the answer that the answer was 27, but you didn't show your work, you didn't get full credit. Here it's almost the opposite, or not completely the opposite, but if you show all the work that went into it and you did something where you picked a fund that ended up having a bad year, if you went through a prudent process to follow that fund, to you had regular updates on the fund, you were watching on a regular basis, doing all these things that are documented, your chances are you're not going to get in trouble for that. But if you just, you go through all these processes that we talked about, but you're not documenting that you looked at your cybersecurity of all your vendors, you went through all the funds in the lineup, all those different things. If you don't go through that and actually put pen to paper and put that in your file, it's going to be tough to defend yourself, say, hey, I followed a prudent process, and then the auditor or whoever that's scrutinizing you says, okay, just show me how you got to your answers, all the work that you did. If you don't have that sitting there, it's much tougher to defend yourself. So we'll wrap up here and open it up for any questions. If folks want to raise their hand, I know there was a couple in the chat, just to show a quick disclosure here, but we'll open it up to anyone with any questions related to audits, the Department of Labor, IRS. We'll do our best to answer. And for the folks that don't have questions, we really, really appreciate you hopping on. And for us at Raymond James, we really appreciate Joe hopping on, and PKF O'Connor Davies for making this happen today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yep. So appreciate it. Anybody have any questions? If you raise your hand, we can unmute you and allow you to just ask your questions, or if you want to pop them in the Q&A and chat them in, that works too. And again, the last bit of housekeeping, there will be an email after this with the deck, some contact information and information about CE.
With 2 minutes left, and there's other questions that come in, just some other things to think about that we've been seeing an uptick in, partial plan terminations. If you've laid off a division, you've laid off a lot of people, something to consider in analysis. Usually if you have more than 20% turnover, or not turnover, reduction in force, something you want to look at from a facts and circumstances situation. There's some detail on what that analysis should look like to determine if there's a partial plan termination, but been seeing a little bit more of that. Just the correction process for any failed testing. You want to follow what your plan document says the correction process should be. So making sure that you're following your plan document. Spousal consent, if your plan requires it for certain things, you should be following that, making sure that you're getting that in your plan. And lastly, just to add forfeitures, right? Making sure that you're using them in accordance with your plan document. There was definitely some recent guidance sent out by the IRS and Department of Labor with regards to forfeitures. So make sure that you're using those each year, really important, and using them in accordance again with your plan document and what it says, the order that you should be using it in, whether it's to reduce employer contributions, reduce plan expenses, or potentially allocate back to participants. Your plan document will lay out what that should look like and how those should be used. And important, that is an area of focus on the Department of Labor and IRS right now.
Yeah, just on that, kind of zeroing in on the plan document, like what we see kind of as a best practice is for plan sponsors and then record keeper and other service providers to kind of get on a call, 60 or 90-minute call once a year, review the plan document, make sure that everyone's aware of the provisions that are in there. There's occasionally times where, and I think as Joe as an auditor may see this, is where the plan document says we're going to limit, to 2 loans, and then you end up in practice, you didn't set it up that way, where there wasn't an upper limit on loans, or there's distribution provisions, and these things happen, over time. There's a lot of provisions, a lot of things that you have to abide by, and mistakes happen. But getting on the phone with everybody so that the record keeper, the plan sponsor, other vendors are on there saying, hey, this is how it's working. let's make sure that our practice and what we're actually doing in reality matches the plan document. And then you can always update it, and if you want to modernize it or improve the plan in terms of plan design, you can do that as well. So in the absence of question, we're at an hour here. We really appreciate everyone hopping on. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and be on the lookout for an email from us after this call. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.